Contrails raiders were the best known of the pro-Confederate partisan rangers who fought in the American Civil War. The leader was William Quantrill, and they included Jesse James and his brother Frank. Early in the war, Missouri and Kansas, nominally under Union government, had become bandit country, with groups of Confederate bushwhackers and anti-slavery Jayhawkers competing for control. The town of Lawrence, Kansas, a center of anti-slavery sentiment, had outlawed Quantrill's men and jailed some of the young womenfolk. In August 1863, Quantrill led a furious attack on the town, killing over 180 civilians, supposedly in retaliation for the casualties caused when the women's jail had collapsed, possibly by design. The Confederate government, which had granted Quantrill a field commission under the Partisan Ranger Act, was outraged and withdrew support for such irregular forces. By 1864, Quantrill had lost control of the group, which split up into small bands. Some, including Quantrill, were killed in various engagements. Others lived on to hold reunions many years later, when the name Contrails Raiders began to be used. Origins: the Missouri-Kansas border area was fertile ground for the outbreak of guerrilla warfare when the Civil War erupted in 1861. Historian Albert Castell wrote, "For over 6 years ever since Kansas was opened up as a territory by Stephen A. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Bill of 1854, its prairies had been the stage for an almost incessant series of political conventions, raids, massacres, pitched battles, and atrocities, all part of a fierce conflict between the Free State and pro-slavery forces that had come to Kansas to settle and to battle." In February 1861, Missouri voters elected delegates to a statewide convention, which rejected secession by a vote of 89 to 1. Unionists, led by regular U.S. Army Commander Nathaniel Lyon and Frank Blair of the politically powerful Blair family, and increasingly pro-secessionist forces, led by Governor Claiborne Jackson and future Confederate General Sterling Price, contested for the political and military control of the state. By June, there was open warfare between Union forces and troops supporting the Confederacy. Guerrilla warfare immediately erupted throughout the state and intensified in August after the Union defeat at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. By August 1862, with the Union victory at the Battle of Pea Ridge, the state was free of significant regular Confederate troops, but the violence in Missouri continued. One historical work describes the situation in the state after Wilson's Creek. Unlike other border areas in Maryland and Kentucky, local conflicts, bushwhacking, sniping, and guerrilla fighting marked this period of Missouri history. When regular troops were absent, the improvised war often assumed a deadly guerrilla nature as local citizens took up arms spontaneously against their neighbors. This was a war of stealth and raid without a front, without formal organization, and with almost no division between the civilian and the warrior. The most notorious of these guerrilla forces was led by William Clark Quantrill. Methods and legal status: Quantrill was not the only Confederate guerrilla operating in Missouri, but he rapidly gained the greatest notoriety. He and his men ambushed Union patrols and supply convoys, seized the mail, and occasionally struck towns on either side of the Kansas-Missouri border, reflecting the internecine nature of the guerrilla conflict in Missouri. Quantrill directed much of his effort against pro-Union civilians, attempting to drive them from the territory where he operated. Contrails Gorillas attacked Jayhawkers, Union militia, and U.S. forces relying primarily on ambush and raids. Under his direction, Confederate guerrillas perfected military tactics such as disguises, coordinated and synchronized attacks, planned dispersal after an attack using pre-planned routes and relays of horses, and technical methods, including the use of multiple .36 caliber Colt revolvers revolvers, for increased firepower and their improved accuracy over the .44 caliber. Confederate induction. On 15 August 1862, Quantrill was granted a field commission as a captain in the Confederate Army under the Confederate Partisan Ranger Act. Other officers were elected by the men. Quantrill often referred to himself as a colonel. Despite the legal responsibility assumed by the Confederate government, Quantrill often acted on his own with little concern for his government's policy or orders. His most notable operation was the Lawrence Massacre, a revenge raid on Lawrence, Kansas in August 1863. Lawrence Massacre. Lawrence had historically been the base of operations for abolitionist and Jayhawker organizations. During the period of border warfare known as Bleeding Kansas in the press, and during the Civil War, irregular raids into Missouri by abolitionists, redlegs, and Jayhawkers and Union soldiers resulted in robberies, theft, arson, and the murder of citizens. In August 1863, Union authorities assigned to the border were frustrated by the hit-and-run tactics of Contrails guerrillas, and particularly the aid provided by Confederate sympathizers in western Missouri. Authorities began imprisoning the female family members of the known guerrillas, with the intent of banishing them. These females, some teenagers, were jailed in Kansas City, Missouri, in George Caleb Bingham's house on Grand Street. Alterations in an adjoining structure plus an extra story that had been added by Bingham resulted in the collapse of the structure. Several women were maimed and killed. The deaths of female non-combatants caused outrage among the guerrillas. Calling for revenge, Quantrill organized a unified partisan raid on Lawrence, coordinating across vast distances. Small bands of partisans rode across 50 miles of open prairie to rendezvous on Mount Ared in the early morning hours before the raid. Quantrill's men burned a quarter of the town's buildings and killed at least 150 men and boys. One of the main targets of the raid, abolitionist U.S. Senator Jim Lane, escaped by fleeing into cornfields. The Lawrence raid was the most deadly and infamous operation of Missouri's Confederate guerrillas. Confederate reaction. The Confederate leadership was appalled by the raid and withdrew even tacit support from the bushwhackers. Following the raid, in the winter of 1863–64, Quantrill led his men behind Confederate lines into Texas, where their often lawless presence proved an embarrassment to the Confederate command. Some Confederate officers appreciated the effectiveness of these irregulars against Union forces, which rarely gained the upper hand over them, especially Quantrill. Among these was General Joseph O. Shelby, who rode south into Mexico with his troops rather than surrender at the end of the war, and whose command was remembered as the undefeated. Their exploits are also immortalized in a later addition to the post-war ballad, The Unreconstructed Rebel. I won't be reconstructed, I'm better now than then. And for that carpetbagger I do not care a damn. So it's forward to the frontier soon as I can go. I'll fix me up a weapon and start for Mexico. John Noland. Among Quantrill's men was a freed former slave man named John Noland. He was one of Quantrill's scouts, reputed to be his best one. Noland helped scouting Lawrence, Kansas, before the raid by Quantrill's men in 1863. He joined Quantrill's raiders because of the abuse his family suffered at the hands of Kansas Jayhawkers. Post-war pictures show him sitting with comrades at reunions of the raiders. In the 1999 movie Ride with the Devil, depicting a group of fictionalized Missouri bushwhackers similar to those of Quantrill's raiders as well as the Lawrence raid, the character of Daniel Holt was representative of Quantrill's John Noland. Dissolution and aftermath. During late winter 1863, Quantrill lost his hold over his men. In early 1864, the guerrillas he had led through the streets of Lawrence returned from Texas to Missouri in separate bands, none led by Quantrill himself. Death's Contrails Gorillas, as a group, did not maintain operations in winters along the border. Quantrill would lead his men to Tyler, Texas over winter and offer his services to the Confederacy. Their assignments included attacking Teamsters who supplied the Union, repelling Union and Jayhawkers raids into northern Texas, repelling native Indians and policing and rounding up deserters roaming in Texas and Oklahoma. The guerrillas were rowdy, undisciplined and dangerous. Quantrill lost his control of the men in the winter of 1863-64. The men split in two bands and were commanded by Lieutenants Bloody Bill Anderson and George Todd. These guerrillas returned to Missouri, while Quantrill took several of his loyal troops east towards Kentucky. Quantrill's group of guerrillas that went to Kentucky were hunted and tracked by pro-Union soldiers and hired killers. His men were cornered in a barn in Kentucky. A shootout resulted in William Quantrill being injured in the spine, unable to move. He was arrested, but reportedly died a week later from his wounds. William Anderson's splinter group of Quantrill's guerrillas was assigned to duty north of the Missouri River during the General Sterling Price raid in 1864. His duties included disrupting operations north of the Missouri River, drawing Union troops toward his cavalry command. Anderson was reportedly shot dead north of Warwick. His body was dragged through the streets of Richmond, Missouri. His grave marker is located in the Old Mormon Pioneer Cemetery, in the extreme SW corner, behind some pine trees near the road. George Todd's splinter group of Quantrill's guerrillas was attached to Major General Sterling Price's raid across Missouri, south of the Missouri River. He functioned as a cavalry scout and was shot out of his saddle by a Union sniper north of Independence, Missouri, a day before the Battle of Westport. Some of the guerrillas continued under the leadership of Varchie Clement, who kept the raiders together after the war and harassed the state government of Missouri during the tumultuous year of 1866. In December 1866, state militiamen killed Clement in Lexington, but his men continued on as outlaws, emerging in time as the James Younger Gang. Popular culture. In the film's True Grit, protagonist Rooster Cogburn prides himself on being a part of Quantrill's raiders during the Civil War while arguing with Texas Ranger LaBeouf. He also has a cat named General Sterling Price, after a famous Confederate general from Missouri. The main character of the film, the outlawed Josie Wales, joins Bloody Bill Anderson's unit after his family is murdered by Jayhawkers. Ride with the Devil, starring Tobey Maguire, and Duel depicts Quantrill's raiders and the Missouri-Kansas conflict. The Audie Murphy film Arizona Raiders deals with Quantrill's raiders in the period immediately after the Civil War. In the film Bandolero, Mace Bishop compares his riding with Sherman to his brother D. Bishop's riding with Quantrill as war versus meanness. The film Dark Command deals with the fictional William Quantrill's raiders, also led by a partisan made an officer by the Confederacy. The Lone Ranger episode, The Twisted Track, is about a member of Quantrill's raiders seeking revenge against the Union officer who imprisoned him. During the Civil War, Quantrill's raiders are a major element in Wildwood Boys, a biographical novel of Bloody Bill Anderson by James Carlos Blake. In the movie The Hateful Eight, much of the plot centers about the Mannix Marauders, a fictionalized version of Quantrill's raiders. See also the 1969 movie The Desperados.